Hi and welcome back to the T1 build. As you can see, it has progressed significantly. Tracks are on, they're painted, the rubber pads are on. I've even started looking at the upper section. The rear track that I'm sitting on, its rear linkage is on. I've even got some electronics in, and I'm going to talk about all this in a little bit. But before I do, I need to say a massive, massive thank you to those of you that have commented on this build. We've had loads and loads of comments, loads of suggestions about things that perhaps we should be doing that we're not doing. And I just want to address some of those. It's not really fair for you guys to make the comments and then me not to address them. So, I think one of the things that is difficult with these kind of projects is that it's very easy to suggest lots of ideas, but we unfortunately do have a budget for this project. Now, if I had 50 grand to spend on this, then maybe the way I approach things would be slightly different to having the budget that I've got, which is not 50 grand. And so with that in mind, I've got to sort of balance the considerations of budget against the considerations of what's possible within that budget. People have talked about, well, you know, I perhaps should have cast these in silicone and found ways to link them together. We should have used motorcycle chains welded to metal plates. We would have got a better drive system. All of those are absolutely valid, totally valid. But I must admit, the metal, as I addressed in the previous video, the weight was phenomenal. So already the tracks alone, just the tracks alone, are weighing in at a 15 to 20 kilos. The dollies, so all in, we're talking about the bogie and these, each track are 50 kilos each. That's 100 kilos just for the tracks. This thing I'm sitting on here is 28 kilos. The frame, 20 kilos. Batteries are coming in at 30 kilos for the pair. So when you start adding all this up, if we were to have made the tracks out of metal, we could potentially have been looking at nearly 80 to 90 kilos per track, which comes back to, will the 350 watt motors, which is all I'm running on this, actually even move it? And then, you know, we're running Sabertooth, Dimension Engineering Sabertooth 60 time, dual 60 speed controllers, which are rated at about 60 amps with about 120, 130 peak. On ampage, you know, so you're then thinking, well, I've got to upgrade the motors, I've got to upgrade the speed controllers, and things start getting very, very expensive. So you've got to balance all these things, and it is a nightmare. The lower frame was made of 2mm aluminium box section. It's basically 2-inch box section with a kind of about 1.5mm sidewall. Barely strong enough to make it, but it's lightweight. This stuff on top is, again, it's incredibly lightweight steel. But it's still, I've probably got here 150 kilos, and we haven't even got the top section on yet. So this is going to be about a 200 kilo build. And of course, it all comes back to, will the motors drive it? And even if the motors do drive it, will we trip the speed controller out? Are we going to be blowing fuses all the time? So yeah, there's an awful lot to consider. Other comments: how are you going to move it in, get it in the van? Did you do what Mrs. Breaker told you to do and make sure it would fit in the van? It doesn't fit in the van. Mrs. Breaker does know. She's not happy. The lower section fits in the van. So I am unfortunately now going to have to build it so that the torso, I suppose you could call it that, is going to be separated from this, and then the guns will be separate. So it will fit in the van. It's just that obviously we're going to have to separate it all out. But as a build, at the moment, it's a little bit smaller than I expected, although that's not a bad thing. It's going to sit, when it's fully raised up, it's about 10 feet. So 2.5 meters, which is still fairly imposing. So really, in terms of where we're at, this is where we're at the moment. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the electronics on the T1. Now, we'll start off with, well, some of the electronics on the T1. This is really just focusing on the drive system. There's going to be a lot more electronics above with the guns and all the other bits and pieces. But anyway, you can see now here we've got the two batteries. Everything is kind of mocked up at the moment. It's all a bit mobile. 250 amp hour 12 volt SLA batteries running at 24 volts. So we got a 24 volt feed to the motors. I might change that to 36. I might. we'll see. I think 24 will be all right, but it depends on our ampages, what kind of currents we're going to be drawing. If the currents are too high, I'll knock it down. Well, I'll knock it up to 36, which will drop the current down. As you can see, yes, this does look like an electronics consumer box. That's because it's waterproof, and all the electronics on this have got to be waterproof. Massive big kill switch on the front, and a charge socket on the front. Kill switch will, unfortunately, be part of the design. It has to be, because this is going to be a big object. We have to be able to get in there and kill the power if we need to. But all of this will just be able to open to get to the electronics. Now, this is just very basic at the moment. We've got a 60 amp saber-tooth speed controller in there, which is going to be controlling the main two 350 watt motors. Everything kind of runs through a nice big chunky fuse. We've got at the moment 100 amp fuse, and again this is 24 volts going through, so there's a fair amount of current flowing through this thing. As you can see, the wires are fairly beefy from the battery to the speed controllers, so it basically power comes into the kill switch, goes to the primary fuse, then we go into a smaller fuse box which will feed the smaller speed controllers. So there will be a speed controller. These are duals I use, so one speed controller will control the rear steering, and it will control the lower actuator for this arm going up and down. There'll be another speed controller in here that will control the rotation, and it will control the up and down of the upper section armature actuator. The primary speed controller is going to control obviously the drive on it. Obviously going to the motors. We're not going to bother disconnecting the motors like we do with the droids, you know, with the physical disconnection, because the motors have got switches that can allow them to be mechanically disconnected, and I've left those in, so when we're pushing it around it's all mechanically disconnected. Once we engage the clutch system, it's engaged. But there are still 70 amp resettable fuses on each motor, just to, you know, just in case. I always like the idea, put fuses on things. If a fuse blows, especially if it's resettable, you're not lost anything. If you calculate it wrong, buy another one. They cost pennies compared to the cost of a speed controller if you blow it up. Although saying that, the Dimension Engineering ones, the saber-tooth ones, are pretty robust. They're pretty good. Feeding off these two is going to be a 24 volt to 12 volt step down that will feed power to the upper section. Initially, I was going to run a separate battery in the upper section, but I've decided not to. I'm not using a split ring for the rotation. I'm just not going to rotate it 360 degrees. Number one, because it will just look stupid. Spinning its head like a droid's head spins, it's just silly. And also the inertia of those guns spinning of that speed would just be ridiculous. So I'm just going to use a tether to the top and just limit the rotation. So there you have it. Everything's wired up. The next thing now is going to be testing it and see what happens. Okay then, the moment of truth. Yeah, it is really nerve-wracking. You know, you go to all this trouble and then something breaks and you just feel demoralised. Anyway, kill switch is on. As I said, it's got a physical engagement and disengagement. I do this, and now basically we are ready to move. So let's see what happens. It works. Right, so I am so excited about the fact that that worked, especially the way it spins. It's a tank. I've built a tank. The problem is this thing. I'm just so annoyed about this. When it's on, it looks super, super cool. It just looks so good. But it's just a pain. It's a pain to maneuver it. The problem is that as soon as this is fixed on here, this can no longer function like a tank. So all of that really cool spinning that you can do with a track system, as soon as this goes on the back, you can't do it. It's become like a Robin Reliant. You know, you have to turn it round the corners. This then is obviously steered going around the corners. So I don't know. I'm going to have to think about this. I don't want to get rid of it because I really like it, but at the same time, I'm going to have to come up with a system. And anyway, as you notice, the original design of this has changed massively because the original design just didn't work. There was so much friction that it was blowing 80 amp fuses. They were just tripping out. As soon as I put the back bit on and drove it, boom, the fuse would just go. There's just too much traction, too much friction. So this has been significantly redesigned, and it's just wheels now. And you can see I've changed the configuration of the wheels, telltale hole, you know, because I've moved it around completely. What you will have noticed I've done is I've taken the big drive wheel off the top because it just doesn't need it. I don't know, my brain wasn't working properly. Just the weight of it alone moves it beautifully. It didn't need the inner sprocket systems on this one because it was never going to be driven. What I've also done is moved the big wheel from the top to this point here. So if you notice, it's created a different shape in the track. Now, all right, it's not 100% screen accurate, but there's screen accurate and then there's the real world. If I make it screen accurate, it can't go around corners properly. Well, that's not true. It can go around corners, but it can't go backwards and it can't spin. It can't do the things that I want it to do. So what I've done is I've put the bigger wheel at the bottom and I've moved the center of gravity on this engagement pin. I'll show you in a minute with this attached. But what it does, it means that when this is attached, it pivots up like this. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. It pivots up like this. Now it's rotating about this big wheel, and that means the track is contact patch with the ground has become, instead of the whole width of the track, it's become really small. So it's acting much more like a caster. It can actually spin. You can see I can move it much more evenly on the ground. So when it comes to being attached and spinning round, it's not dragging the whole weight of this track around. It's only dragging a small contact patch around as it moves. And it works. It works. And that was just by moving this center of, can't see that there, but the center where the pivot is directly over the wheel. So when it engages, it pivots. There we go. I'll move it to there. It pivots really, really well. Got the rear track on. We're ready to sort of go, really. Give you a quick demo of the steering. I think I'll mess the actuator up. I don't know why. It wasn't a very good one, but anyway, it gives you an idea. Look. Shouldn't be making that noise, but it still seems to work. So it does look kind of good. And then obviously it will move forwards. Of course, it will move back. Now, this is the bit that I was talking about. This is where I've got to kind of relearn how to twiddle my thumbs around. Now, I am thinking I might, for this build, use a different kind of radio. I might go for a radio that is a little bit more programmable than this. And what I mean by that is I can do this. So I think, well, if I'm going to turn that way, I can go like a little bit more. See, it's so hard to get your brain to work around which way. So obviously that track has got to go faster than this track if I'm turning that way, because I can't just turn it, because then this will be sliding sideways. I mean, if I can get right round at that angle, even then, unless you get the angle exactly right on the turn, it's still going to be dragging this sideways. Now, that's not a problem in itself. It's just the amount of then stress it's going to put on the motors, and even then that's not a problem in itself for the motors. That's a problem for the speed controller now, which I never really thought would be taxed. So yeah, it works. We go backwards and we can turn at the same time. But it's going to be about me. I'm the weak link now. That I've got to relearn how to do this, and it just might be easier using a radio that I can just program all that. So all I really do is move forward on the stick and even use a gyro system. So if I tilt the radio, this just automatically turns. So in a way, it's like a steering wheel. Interestingly, if you look very, very carefully at some videos online about when they made the T-1, of course their robots were tethered because they had they did all these with hydraulics. They used a steering wheel system, so they basically had someone walking behind it, tethered to it, and it also was radio controlled. It had non-tethered versions, but they were using a steering wheel. So as they turned the wheel, this moved proportionately with the control unit. So all the operator has to do is simply apply throttle. So you go forwards. As this turns, if you turn right, this track will automatically go faster. This track will automatically go slower, or even into reverse, and the opposite will happen the other way. This kind of radio is really, really difficult to control this. I can go forwards and backwards. Well, I did forget to mention, underneath the electronics and the batteries, I've added about an inch of absorption material, because you can listen to this. It's clanky, isn't it? Most of the noise is actually coming from the aluminium drive wheels at the front. I thought maybe I might put some rubber around the edge of the wheels, might make it a little bit quieter. So basically, part one of the Terminator project is not finished, far from it, but we have a moving base, which means I always said that if this bit didn't work, I wasn't going to move on to the next bit. I'm not going to build a static. So now we start building upwards.